that into my presentation before I go into human rights. So my first moment of truth is when I was 8 years old, and I wanted to be a world leader, bring world peace, promote human rights, and not in the kind of pageant way, but in a really serious way. And I'd go to sleep at night thinking about it and planning about it. I then went to a convent school, and for a while I thought I might be a nun. Even the nuns didn't think that I had what it took to be a nun. Then I made up my mind I was going to be an air hostess and travel the world. And I was going to do all of this before I brought world peace. But to be absolutely honest, from the age of 8, I knew that I was going to be a lawyer because I idolized my father, and I thought that being a lawyer was a really useful thing in society. And so my second truth came when I became a human rights lawyer. And it's my passion, and I'm glad that today I have the opportunity to talk to you about human rights. And the work that I do is largely dealing with immigration and asylum. And we had Stephen this morning speaking about the rate of migration. So some of those vulnerable people do find themselves consulting with me. Then I had a third moment of truth. And I hope I don't have two other many moments of truth because it keeps me very, very busy. But a lot has been invested in me. And I've done a lot of investment in myself in terms of leadership. And so my third truth is using my voice for leadership development. And this whole thing about legacy, that whatever we do is transformative. And what we're doing today, I hope, is also going to be transformative. So we change things for the better. And that's my third truth. So I try to talk about leadership wherever I go. And last week, I went for a book signing of a Ghanaian photographer. And this is what he said. He said, "A society grows great when old men plant trees whose shade they know they shall never sit in." And this is a Greek saying. And it's quite opportune that I'm speaking just after this particular topic. But that was important because whatever we're doing, it's for ourselves, but those who are coming afterwards. And especially in terms of human rights. And what Stephen said really, really struck me. It's how, in our own way, whether we're biased consciously or unconsciously, we seem to give human rights to different people depending on where they come from. So as Stephen said, we might not be too aghast that over 100,000 Iraqis have died in the past few years. But if that had happened here in the United Kingdom, I think that would be quite different. It's just something for us to reflect upon. And what I'll be talking about today is going to be very different from what I did last time, because that was more around equality, diversity, motivation, etc. But we're going to look at and see the definition of human rights. Look very briefly at the history of human rights. Why do we have human rights? Look at the provisions of the human rights. And within your park, Hajit, Mick, and the rest of the team have actually given you some information, so you can refer to that whilst I speak. Last time I came here, there was some of the feedback that relates to all the speakers was death by PowerPoint. So I thought I wouldn't kill you with PowerPoint today, but you do have some information in there. We'll also look at public body responsibility, and the NHS is the largest public body. And so what is the NHS's responsibility in terms of human rights? We'll consider very briefly how human rights is a really useful tool of inclusive patient care, a tool for improving how we care for those who are vulnerable and under our care here at NELFT. We'll look at some practical application of human rights, and we'll do that by use of video and a short discussion thereafter. And then you'll be glad to know that in line with what Wellington said, you too have human rights. It's not just people that you're caring for. So we will look at your human rights, because if your human rights are upheld, you're more likely than not to uphold the rights of other people. We look briefly at what to do when you feel that your own rights may have been breached. And then I was going to talk about further sources of information, but you have it all in your booklets. So I'll go straight into it. And most of you may already know, and if you do, then it's a refresher, because you rarely have time from your busy lives to just sit back and reflect about human rights. So these are basic rights and freedoms which are guaranteed to everybody, regardless of nationality or lack of nationality or what your life choices are. Here in the UK, our human rights are protected by the Human Rights Act of 1998. And just looking at how we got to have the Human Rights of 1998, it actually began, and again, it's really good to talk because Stephen actually has done part of my job. During and after World War II, 30% of the world was moving because of the war. And actually, the Human Rights Act came post-World War II. Following the genocide, millions were killed. The peace was very uneasy. There was still military persecution, and the racism was rife. So the United Nations was founded. And following the founding of the United Nations, we had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And from that, we've got the European Convention of Human Rights, which now sits here as the Human Rights Act 1998. It is very interesting at the moment, our politicians are talking about getting rid of the Human Rights Act. They will replace it, if they have their way, with a UK Bill of Rights. But the UK was instrumental in drafting and enacting the European Convention of Human Rights. UK lawyers were at the center of drafting that, and so it's quite interesting that fast forward, we're trying to get rid of it and replace it with something else. So you have your packs, and we're going to look at the human rights, just go through them very quickly, just whiz through it. So the right to life, and you're working in an institution where you're not only preserving life, but seeking to improve and uphold the quality of life. And so this is very important for all of you. Freedom from torture and inhumane treatment. It could be as simple as not leaving your patients in soiled sheets over long periods of time, or actually for any period of time, because we have this whole thing about whose role is it? Is it the carer? Is it the nurse? Is it the family of the person that's receiving the care? But that kind of undignified treatment is actually a violation of somebody's human rights. It's degrading treatment. Then we've got freedom from slavery and forced labor. Now, in other parts of the world, we have child labor, whereby you have domestic servants, but it happens here in the United Kingdom. We also have people who are forced into the sex industry, and they are slaves, and that's happening under our noses. And with this great push, because of what's going on within the Middle East, there's a lot of people who are vulnerable. And so we will find that slavery is actually growing in Europe and United Kingdom as well. Then there's a right to liberty and to security. And this may be appropriate to those of you who work within NELFT, and especially because you're a mental health trust in particular, you have a department dealing with mental health. Right to liberty and security. When is a decision made to take away someone's liberty? When they're a risk to themselves, a risk to the public? What's the decision-making process? Are you just considering the procedure to look at mental capacity, but are you also considering the human rights of that particular patient? A right to a fair trial. Now, there's one thing that really is a bug hate of mine. And when I deliver training, this whole thing about grievances and disciplinaries, the term in itself suggests that you have done something wrong. It's simply an allegation. So it should not be called a disciplinary, unless, of course, you're found culpable, and then you're then disciplined. And that means that just by the wording that we're using, taking away that right to a fair trial is not just what we do, it's the appearance of what we do. So if you then say that Jackie is involved in disciplinary, you put a cloud over me. It's quite different if it's just simply a complaint. And the human rights can really come in very, very practical ways. This whole thing about Article 7, no punishment without law, it's the same thing. When you give me the label of being under disciplinary or under a grievance, you're already punishing me because people are biased. And so when I come back after this disciplinary and my name has actually been cleared, but no one has told you that, so I've had this punishment without the law taking its full course. And it's just to try to get you to think about the practical application of human rights and the various things that you do. Then we have this whole thing about respect for private life and family life, home and correspondence. It could be a simple thing as someone's private life is their health. So they're sitting in your wards. Our wards are very full. It's just the way the reality is. And then you all come in, all you caregivers, discussing my private life. at top volume, at your loudest voice, talking about it so that everybody can hear, other patients, visitors, etc., it is a violation of my private life. So it might be simple things. It might just be not because we want to violate people's rights, it's because we've fallen into bad habits. So what's to stop us to think for a moment? There's not so much space. They're likely to hear, but I'm not going to raise my voice. Draw the curtains and at least keep your voice low, that it's more confidential. So it's the little things that we do. Freedom of thought, belief, and religion. And the chaplain was amazing, and he really should do a roadshow. And I'm going to ask him to try and, I did say to you, to zhuzh up my presentation. So thank you very much for that. And so this whole thing about freedom of thought, belief, and religion. Very recently, one of your colleagues in a different trust found herself before the tribunal. And what she was a Christian. She still is a Christian. And she was speaking to a colleague about converting from Islam to Christianity. And went as far as to bring in literature, brought in a book about the conversion. Now she has every right to her own belief and to her own religion, but she definitely has got no right to impose it on anybody else. Deliberate and sustained. So she got a final warning and then went off to court and relied on the very same human rights, freedom of thought, belief, and religion, and was fortunate to have that downgraded to a fast warning. So actually you can use human rights to protect your own position, but also to defend yourself against unwarranted complaints if you feel that's the position. And then we have freedom of expression, assembly and association, which is Articles 10 and 11. We saw the doctors, the junior doctors recently demonstrating, striking. They're using their freedom of expression, assembly and association. If we didn't have the human rights, then they wouldn't be able to do that. The right to marry and start a family, and protection against discrimination in respect of these rights and freedoms. So nobody can be excluded from the protection and freedoms you find within the Human Rights Act. And I'd like to give you my own story. I was a teenage mom at a convent school, at a Catholic school, and I was 16 when I had my daughter. Now, at that time in Kenya, that was practically taboo. The name of that school was Loreto Convent, Musangari. So you can imagine the reaction. So deputy head teacher promptly called me. It was 2 days to the end of term and said, oh, well, Jacqueline, you can't come back next term. It's an abomination. What a large word. The first time I had that word, abomination. And if you persist in this stupidity of yours and come back next time, I'm going to expose you to the Board of Governors and the Parent Teachers Association. You bring shame to yourself, your family, and to the school. But fortunately for me, I wasn't the stereotypical young person like in that video. I didn't go and blog about or do a video. I spoke to my mom. And so I remember mom picking me up from school, and it was a long drive. By the time we reached the top of the avenue, she had come back down to speak to the head teacher. Now, I'm not sure the exact words that transpired between my mother and the head teacher. But what I do know that she said was what she said. Jacqueline is entitled to a right to education. She's entitled to a private life, which means an education, and also having a family. Jacqueline has not broken any of the school rules and should not be discriminated against because she's expecting. I only missed 2 weeks of school. That was in April. I had Vanessa on the 3rd of May and went back to the same convent school. My father was this big shot lawyer. My mother, nurse and counselor, knew exactly how to uphold my human rights. And so from a very early age, I could see the operation of human rights, respecting, protecting rights, freedoms, and dignity. So thank you to my mom and to Sister Pauline, who was a very, very, let's say vicious, but we called her Power. She rarely said anything, and the school was over 10 acres of land. But once she clapped anywhere on the school, you stopped in your tracks and looked at yourself to make sure that you were not doing anything wrong. But she respected my human rights, and she showed compassion and gave me a dignified return to school. And when I went back to school, teachers weren't very happy. They thought, look at her, after going off and getting pregnant, convent school, coming back here to a hero's welcome. So they tried to discriminate because I had fallen pregnant and now I was a teenage mother, but I had the support of the entire school community because there was communication. So there's a lot of talk about communication here today. So there were rumors. Did she have an abortion? Did she lose a baby? Is it a boy, a girl, is it twins? So to stop all that rumor mongering, before I went back to school, there was an announcement. Jackie Onalo is coming back. She's got a beautiful baby girl. Be supportive. There was nothing to say. So sometimes when we don't communicate, we cause so much difficulty for ourselves. But I am digressing. It was just to demonstrate how human rights operate in our day-to-day lives. Now, the rights that we have can be absolute rights, qualified rights, or limited rights. So, for example, the right to life is an absolute life. The freedom from torture and degrading treatment is absolute. So for that reason, we won't send back terrorists to countries whereby they're going to suffer this kind of inhumane and degrading treatment, or they're going to suffer the death penalty. So that's the reason why we have the human rights. Now, limited rights can be taken away, but it has to be within the operation of the law. It has to be necessary and proportionate. So your rights can be taken away in the interest of national security, prevention of crime, upholding health. So you could be quarantined. We could all be quarantined if something broke out in the interest of protecting public health. So some rights are absolute and others are not. So freedom of movement, for example, can be curtailed. Then we've got qualified rights. So I've spoken about this right to a family life, and we have loads of immigrants who come here and they spend long periods of time here, and some of them may not have permission to stay in this country. They might lose their case and they might then say, you know what, we've been here for the past 12 years. Children are born here. The only life that we know is the life in the United Kingdom. So do allow us to stay on the basis of a family and private life. But they often lose that argument because the Home Office has got a right to protect our borders. And so therefore, there's this balancing exercise that is going on all the time. And in your own jobs, do you or do you not section somebody? They've got the right to liberty, freedom of expression, etc. But then you've got to have this continuous balancing exercise. And I recall back to the Charlie Hebdo, the bombing. And everybody was up on social media with photographs of themselves saying, I am Charlie. And that was fine. I put up one for about 10 minutes. Then I thought about it and I said, perhaps I'm not Charlie. And this is what I put on Facebook. I said, I am Jacqueline. I am against terrorism. I am for freedom of expression, but against religious sacrilege. With rights come responsibility. Religion is not hate. Islam is not terrorism. It's very easy to jump, but the balancing exercise can be difficult. Now, this is going to mean to trouble a lot of different people because what I mean and what people understand me to mean can be very different. But it's this whole thing that if you've got rights, you've got responsibility. You have a right of expression. Like about the Pope last year said that if you insult his mother, he's going to give you a shiner. He's going to give you a slap. And so why should people have the right to insult people's families, to insult their religion? So with all that we do, it should be a balancing exercise. Now, that's not to say that what happened in Paris was right. It wasn't. Because we all know that Islam is not about hate. And terrorism has got nothing to do with Islam. And it's just having this fine line and treating people as we'd like them to treat ourselves. So this freedom of expression, though we've got a right to say what we like, but the law stops us from being libelous and slanderous. So that balancing exercise. So human rights. So all public bodies, including the NHS, have got an obligation to respect and uphold human rights in carrying out your role. So you must consider the human rights of your patients in every decision that you make regarding their care. Not just at the beginning, but actually at every stage. It's a legal requirement. But this is my view. despite the legality of it, it's actually good practice. And I would say a fair majority of your colleagues at NELFT and the NHS are carrying this out. Good practice considering the human rights of the patients. It does actually provide for better quality of care. We heard about this communication, knowing your patient. If you know your patient, you can treat them better because they're not just their body, they're more than that. It also means that you're providing moral care. So apart from the legal imperative, it's good practice, it improves the quality of care, and it is actually a moral way and a dignified way of taking care of patients. So I'm going to actually skip through some of the stuff that I had to say because I know that we don't have that much time this afternoon. But in terms of torture and inhumane treatment, it could be small things that we do. Why would you leave food in front of a patient? You haven't read their notes and they have no capacity to eat the food. They can't actually physically eat the food. Would it not be torturous for them to have that food sitting there for the 1 hour lunch or dinner break and they actually can't eat it? So it could be very serious things, but it could be small things which are actually degrading treatment. Now, sometimes you've got to use force to restrain some of the patients that you may encounter. Is the force that you're using excessive? So it's that thought at every juncture of making those decisions. For the patients that you deal with require a lot of support, and we heard from Anne this morning about the level of support people have got different ability from us would require. But you've got to treat them with dignity. So some of your patients might need help with washing and dressing up. But how do you actually do it? Do you treat them as a human being? Do you treat them the way that you treat yourself or someone that you cared about? And all this has got to do with human rights. We spoke about a right of respect of the private life. And this whole thing about patient voices in deciding care. And I'll give you another example because I do enjoy telling a story. My father, bless his soul, would have passed away for 9 years this September. But the year that he passed away, he was very unwell in hospital. And I remember this consultant. He would come in every evening. Time frame, 1 to 4 minutes. He would come around, look at my father, not talk to anybody, make some notes and go away. Now I, a human rights lawyer, that is always defending other people's rights, I was in awe of him. I was afraid of him. In case I said the wrong thing and my father did not receive the kind of care that he was entitled to. So we had to rely on third parties to come back and tell us what the consultant thought. How can that be right? My father, a top attorney, an author, he was actually also, for the West Ham Farms, he was actually a chairman of a football club. This man with all this power and dignity, just being looked at, not being engaged in. And then asked his family as well, not being so sure about what we should do. And again, it's human rights, dignity, in terms of seeking consultation with your patients. But I am not completely blameless. When my father became very unwell and then developed meningitis in the brain, we made the decision that we should be moved from one hospital to another hospital that had better facilities. It was the right decision. But we did not consult him. We simply said, Dad, this is what's going to happen tomorrow. Lo and behold, the ambulance arrived. And I remember seeing him in the taxi, in the ambulance, and he seemed very anguished. That anguish would have been reduced if we had consulted with him, if we had sought to uphold his human rights. And that's something that you should think about again. At every stage of your patient care, you should be considering human rights. So I'm just going to have like a quick run through. And we had Enact this morning, and they did the performing arts. And they spoke about one of your trust values, being professional and honest. I thought that was quite important in terms of dealing with human rights, because you should be able to identify and challenge breaches from your colleagues. Now, it's usually quite good to stick by your colleagues, which is good, but we do know that sometimes it does lead to very serious situations. And often a talk, some training, some reminder can deal with those breaches. And then we had Eunice, the chaplain, and he spoke about patients not being just bodies. If you remember that, you're onto a good thing. You're dealing with human rights, but you're improving the care of patients. And then we had Carol Baxter and Wellington, who spoke about a time whereby we'll have success, where we don't need strategic plans, we don't need reliance on policies, you don't need to have these talks about human rights, because you'll be doing it as a matter of course. You're probably already doing it, but just not attaching the title human rights to it. And then we had Anne Wafula Olympia Strike, who said that everybody should be treated with dignity and given the opportunity to express themselves, including being involved in the care that they're going to receive. So therefore, I would urge you and encourage you to continue considering human rights in everything that you do with your patients at every stage, not just the beginning, but throughout the process whereby decisions have to be made. Now, I'm going to go very quickly to look at your own human rights. You too have exactly the same human rights, which have to be upheld, they have to be recognized, and they have to be respected. So, you should also not be subject to abuse or to violence from patients or other members of staff. And NELFT, the trust, should ensure that that happens. So your rights should be protected. You should not be humiliated in front of your colleagues. It happens in all industries, in all sectors, where somebody might say something like, "Are you semi-literate? It took you so long to read that report." It's humiliating, it's degrading, and those kind of things that people say amongst colleagues without really thinking about it. I spoke about the right to a fair trial, disciplinary grievance. It's simply an allegation, a complaint. And I know from HR, from your own statistics, that in a majority of cases, these complaints are actually not upheld. So a right to a fair trial, and a right not to be punished if you've not been found to be culpable. A right to a family and private life. Now, you have your own lives outside NELFT, and that means that on occasion, you would be entitled with reason to have, say, compassionate leave to take care of a sick child, to attend a funeral, to go on vacation, etc. And NELFT has to respect your family rights within reason. A right to an education, which means continuous professional development. But what happens? I have been training some of your mid-managers here and at other trusts as well. And one common complaint is that when people go and ask for training, they're told, what has this got to do with the technical skills of what you're doing? So why are you going for leadership training? Assertiveness, you're a nurse, you're a doctor. So it's this thing, it's a right to an education, but also a right to choose how you need to be empowered. Was it Wellington who spoke about somebody who had PhD and was at Band 5? Perhaps if they had been doing other types of training, for example, leadership training, they might have benefited. And so it's just this whole thing about considering how things go. Talking about no punishment, we spoke about free speech, protest, and joining associations. There are loads of staff networks. You're not in those staff networks, we do not have the freedom to join various associations. Freedom of speech, the junior doctors. Now, what happens when there's been a breach of your rights? Now, I'm not encouraging you to all go and find breaches and all go and run off to HR. But if something happens, you can use the informal complaint, a formal complaint, you can go for legal action. In most cases, statistics show that actually having an informal complaint deals with the matter. If you're going to make a formal complaint, and I think I'll touch on this, you've got to have a description of what happened. So you've got to be very clear in your head about exactly what has happened. You've got to know where it happened, simple things, the time that it happened, and who was involved. You should be able to identify what the particular breach was and how you felt about it. And if possible, what in your mind would be a suitable remedy. And give a time scale of when this should be dealt with. And that often, by and large, can deal with it. If that does not happen, then you can do a written complaint. And again, think about the same things that you're going to mention. This does not stop your right to go to the courts. And why we have the Human Rights Act of 1998 as opposed to relying on the European Convention of Human Rights, it means that you can have recourse to the courts here in the UK without having to go to The Hague. So if you're going to go to court, here's my health warning. It's expensive, it's stressful, it takes a long time. It's not to dissuade you, but to at least consider the informal complaint within the trust. You could also go to the Quality Commission. Remedies, you might get compensation, financial compensation, but that's very, very, very rare in the UK. What people tend to get is a declaration that your rights have been breached. And often that is enough. Maybe in Beatrice's position, Alexandra's mom, if somebody had acknowledged that things had gone wrong, something as simple as that, she wouldn't have been in that position. Because she did acknowledge that things do go wrong, but there was this absolute denial of any culpability. If there's been a breach, the trust might seek to put things right. So for example, if you keep on asking for training and you don't get the opportunity and you make a complaint, the trust may then just decide that you should go for the treatment. It could be as simple as that. So in conclusion, I would just like to say that human rights are very important. As you can see, they permeate all levels of our day-to-day life. And you as professionals, and myself included, I have become case-hardened. I deal with asylum seekers who've gone to some of the most traumatic situations. And sometimes I sit back and I wonder, have I stopped really dealing with them as people? Because I've had it so many times before. But they're still individuals. And I may have had it 100 times before, but I've not had it from that particular person. And so when you're dealing with patients, treat them as individuals and apply the human rights, and I'm going to say this for the umpteenth time today, at every stage of their care. If your rights are upheld, you will uphold the rights of others. And so I'd like to conclude my presentation by saying, by and large, we do uphold each other's human rights. We are fortunate that despite shortcomings that we happen to be in the United Kingdom, where there's respect for human rights. But let's make it an undertaking to ourselves to be more aware of human rights and treat other people as we'd like to be treated ourselves. So thank you very much for listening to me. It's been a long presentation.